This week on Entrepreneurs, we take an in-depth look at the Australian startup ecosystem. I'm Jack Delosa, and Entrepreneurs starts now.
This is Entrepreneurs.
Welcome to Entrepreneurs. Tonight we analyse what the future holds for Aussie startups. Joining me on the panel is Alex McCauley, CEO of Australia's national advocacy group Startup Oz. But first, we recently took a trip to StartCon, Australia's biggest startup event. We spoke with many people there, including founders, including the founder of StartCon and Freelancer.com, Matt Barry.
Matt, you must be proud with what we're sitting in right now. This is an extraordinary event. And all good things start from humble beginnings. I understand this started as a 30-person meetup years ago.
That's right. So Peter Cooper is very well known in the startup scene in Australia. He said, let's get a few people together in Sydney and we'll call it SidStart and we'll just chat about startups. And I think he took a room over at UTS and it was so successful and people were so excited about it. They actually stayed so late that the actual security guards came and had to kick them out. And that snowballed over time, and he ran that for many years. And about 4 years ago, Peter Cooper handed over the reins to us, and we changed the name from SidStart to StartCon. It's gone from that point in time about 1,000 people to today about 4,000 people. The theme this year is Silicon Valley is dead. Long live Silicon Valley. If you've been watching the narrative, it's extremely expensive to run a startup now in Silicon Valley. Engineers are incredibly expensive. They leave your company very, very quickly. Like the tenure is very, very short. Housing is in a crisis across San Francisco and Silicon Valley, so it's very expensive for people to, living costs and so on. It's also not a very fun area to, socially. If you're working, all the time, you kind of want to play as well, and it's a bit boring for that as well. But it just is the sheer competitiveness and the difficulty of starting a business there has meant that startups are now leaving, and there's other ecosystems around the world. Whether you're talking Sydney, whether you're talking Berlin, whether you're talking London. You can actually start a startup now around the world. There's the framework for doing so in terms of financing, entrepreneurs, all the wealth of entrepreneurship knowledge is now online. They can watch your videos, and so on. So, you can really start a company anywhere. So the theme is Silicon Valley is dead, long live Silicon Valley. The flip side being Silicon Valley is going to be around for a long, long, long time to come. So,
how do you see the Australian startup ecosystem evolving?
It's just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. I remember back in 99, 2000, we had this big wave of startups and it died away with the tech wreck, but now it's bigger than ever. It's bigger than it was back in those years, and every year it just keeps building and building and building and building. If you talk to the kids at university who are leaving now, they don't want to go work at someone else's company, they want to do their own company, so it's huge.
Are there any kind of interesting insights that you're observing at the moment in the startup ecosystem in Australia and how it's evolving?
Well, I think we're producing really good operators. Australia is a long way from major markets. You've got to think global on day one. The financing here is getting bigger and bigger, but it is nowhere near the level as Silicon Valley. So you've got to be scrappy, you've got to be a good operator. And the companies that are coming through the ecosystem and are becoming global companies, they're run by phenomenal leaders. You look at Atlassian, Mike Cannon-Brooks and Scott Farquhar. That's now a $30 billion US company, Atlassian. You look at Campaign Monitor, Envato, etc. The operators that do come through are some phenomenal businesses because they learn to really run the business properly as opposed to just raise loads of cash.
You mentioned Atlassian. Freelancer is another great Australian startup that's gone on to publicly list, and it's an incredible story. So let's switch gears a little bit. Talk to us about what are the highlights around Freelancer Limited these days?
Well, the group now has a number of companies that keeps me busy. So we have Freelancer, which is a marketplace for jobs. I guess stepping back, the narrative is the mission for Freelancer Limited is to empower the world's entrepreneurs. So we have Freelancer.com, which is a marketplace for jobs, where you can, that dream of an idea you have, you get someone to build it for you. NASA, we've designed a robotic arm for a free-flying Astrobee robot to the space station. We've done 3D modeling for the image recognition for the Robonaut R2 humanoid robot that's in the space station, looks like Terminator, and so on. So we have a marketplace for jobs. You get to turn that sparkle idea into reality. 30 million people, 15 million projects have gone through to date, and $4.5 million US worth of jobs have been awarded. And on Monday we launched Freelancer, which is a global marketplace for freight. So anything you want to ship.
What's the number one message you'd give to your mum? What are her observations of what you've created here?
Well, she's finally stopped telling me I need to get a real job. So
That's a huge milestone in an entrepreneur's life.
45 years in.
Matt Barry, owner of StartCon, thank you for joining us.
Great, thanks a lot.
Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And what a milestone it is. This was the 9th year for StartCon, and numbers were high with more than 4,000 flocking to the event, with 60 plus speakers and 150 exhibitors. Let's hear what some of the attendees had to say.
Amazon is pioneering at-home beauty in Australia. We're really disrupting the salon space because as a customer, I want instant gratification. I'm time poor and I'm really busy, so I struggle to get to the salon these days. And for the freelancer, we really want to empower them to become micro-entrepreneurs so that they don't have to work in a salon for $23 an hour.
What's been the highlight of the journey so far for you?
Shark Tank was an obvious highlight. Raising capital, raising $1.2 million last year was really a lot of validation for us that we were on the right track, and growing our team to be 7 full-time, passionate employees who really love the business.
I mean, we started because we thought access to capital was the biggest problem that startups face, and now you're seeing more and more venture capital being raised. There's more and more VCs. There's a huge amount of capital being deployed. I think the amount is going up 3 to 4 times year on year.
This is our first time at StartCon.
Same.
I love it.
Same.
It's got a great vibe. And we're talking to businesses that we love working with. I think there's never been a better time to start a business. And there's actually never been a better time to think about global mobility and immigration in your business. So diversity is shown to, bring substantial benefit to a growing business. And so it really goes hand in hand that we're here talking about startups and innovation and mobility and immigration. So it all goes nicely together.
How have you managed to stay ahead of that growth?
Yeah, I think, I don't know if it's a case of staying ahead or catching up, because I think every time we've raised funding, it takes about a year to probably grow into the mindset that comes with that new lot of capital, because, when you've got $500,000 in the bank, you can only do so much. And when you've got 5 million, then you can think differently. So then when you've got 50 million, then it's different again.
And if we go to you, talk to us. Lateral is an incredible concept. What's the problem that it solves?
Before and after surgery, patients have to be transferred onto the hospital table. At the moment, what the situation is that patients are being dragged on a board and sheet, and that hasn't changed in the last 30 years. And so there's a ridiculous amount of healthcare workers who are suffering from back injuries. So we're looking at reducing those rates.
We're very new to this, but the environment's been very supportive. We've got a lot of help from our mentors and lots of advisors, and everyone in the industry is helpful.
Those last 3 young ladies we spoke to are 21, 22 and 23 consecutively. It was incredible to see so many entrepreneurs at StartCon this year. It has indeed been a big month for startups. Alex McCauley, CEO of Startup Oz, is here with me now. Now, Alex, before we chat about Startup Oz, what are your thoughts on Matt Barry's closing statements in terms of, finally, Mum's told me I don't need to go and get a job anymore? Something you must hear a lot.
I reckon this is actually a super important point for the system as a whole. I mean, kids going home, smart kids, coming out of school or uni and telling their parents, I want to go start a business instead of being a lawyer or a doctor. That's a hard conversation to have, and we need to try and make that an easier conversation to have.
I remember I met a guy called Jost Stolman. He was the CEO of a fintech company here in Australia at the time, and he was saying we need to change the mental model around how parents in particular view entrepreneurship and society at large. How do we do that?
Yeah, it's a cultural thing, right? We always talk about capital, talent and culture, and this is that really sort of intangible cultural element. There's actually a thing in the literature called vocational prestige, which is about how prestigious a particular kind of job is, and Australia ranks very poorly in terms of how we see entrepreneurship in terms of our global counterparts. So we can definitely pick it up.
Work to do.
Yeah.
Good. Alex is sticking around. We're going to take a quick break.
You're watching Entrepreneurs. Welcome back to Entrepreneurs.
Welcome back to Entrepreneurs. We are talking to Alex McCauley, CEO of Startup Oz, about the startup landscape. Alex, as I mentioned earlier, Startup Oz was born 5 years ago. A bunch of founders got together and decided the body was needed. So I suppose two questions to kick us off. Why a startup advocacy group? Why was that needed? And what's the change you've seen in the last 5 years?
Yeah, I mean, basically it was formed because there wasn't a national narrative that included startups at the time. Startups didn't have a voice with government at all. Just after Startup Oz was formed, Tony Abbott became Prime Minister, and innovation was a sort of dirty word in the cabinet room for a little while. But of course all that changed when Malcolm Turnbull came in and there was a real uptick. But so Startup Oz really is about representing startups with government. Over the 5 years, there's been a real shift in terms of the momentum and success of the sector. Probably the most visible bit is that 5 years ago, if you're a founder in Australia, there was every chance you'd have to move to Silicon Valley if you wanted to grow a global tech business. And you wanted to do it now because you need to raise some money, and there was no money in Australia. That's changed totally in 5 years. It's gone from about $70 million of venture capital available for founders here to $1 billion invested this year, so more than 10x.
Wow, wow. And the other, you mentioned Malcolm Turnbull. The other thing I understand Startup Oz did was quite instrumental in helping inform what became the innovation agenda under Malcolm Turnbull. Yeah, so Malcolm Turnbull's big signature bit of policy in 2015, the National Innovation and Science Agenda. We did a lot of work with Malcolm and with Wyatt Roy and Christopher Pyne, who was the industry minister at the time, to try and get some of the things that startups had been saying for a long time on the agenda as part of that. Wyatt did a good job, didn't he? It was a relatively short stint, but I was a huge fan of the way he went about things. Yeah, Wyatt's great. I think he'll be back, to be honest. Yeah, good. I hope so. Now, startups are driving a lot of the new jobs growth in Australia. What's behind that trend? It's actually not just in Australia, it's all over the world. Young companies create just about all the jobs in developed economies. And this is something that's totally uncontroversial for economists, but not really in the national conversation. So the real big jobs growth drivers in Australia and everywhere in the developed world are high growth young companies, and really all young tech companies are those kinds of high growth tech companies that are creating jobs. Mate, I'm hugely excited to talk to you about this week. You've released the 2018 Crossroads report, which many people would know is the roadmap for how we build an effective Australian startup ecosystem. What have we done well so far? Yeah, I mean, one of the really biggest things we've done well is solve this capital problem that we talked about just a second ago. If you're a founder in Australia now and you want to raise money to build a global tech business, you can do so from here with Australian investors, and actually there's a whole bunch of international investors who are looking to invest in Australian companies too. And so what that has meant is that there's a huge wave of second generation, if you like, startups. There's the startups that Matt was talking about in his piece at Freelancer, at StartCon, that were around in the sort of late .com era, and now we've got companies formed in the last 10 years that are about to seriously hit the big time, and they'll become household names. Just this year we had Canva, who became $1 billion business. I think there'll be 5 or 10 more joining Canva in the next couple of years. It is incredibly encouraging to see. What are the challenges that still exist? I think one of the biggest challenges at the moment actually is the political narrative around technology. Technology is a bit scary sometimes. It's disruptive, it's going to change the way we do business, and I think that puts people on the back foot a lot of the time. But I think the thing we've got to realise is it's going to do that whether or not we like it. We can't stick our head in the sand. We've got to go out and create some fantastic tech companies to really grab the value that technology brings so that we end up as one of the disruptors, not one of the disrupted. I'm glad you mentioned the tech phobia. What is that, and what needs to change? Yeah, I mean, I think with anything that people don't quite understand, there's always a bit of fear around. And so this tech phobia, as it relates to founders of startup businesses, there's a tech phobia? No, I think it's, look, to be honest, it's probably driven by a view of big tech. The big tech companies coming out of the US. There's a whole political narrative about tax, there's a political narrative about privacy, and all that stuff has actually flowed on to startups in a way that I think is potentially quite damaging for the sector if we don't get it right. So it's not startup founders are not embracing technology, it's that there's a political and somewhat media agenda that's not all that great, not putting tech business in the right light. Yeah, that's right. And I think on the startup side, I think, it was very sexy a few years ago to be a startup. These days, I think there's a little bit of a hint of, is this just hipsters in Surrey Hills, running businesses like this? And that's something we've absolutely got to change because, we know, we had Luke from Safety Culture on the Grab earlier. He founded his business in Townsville, and that business has now raised $100 million in venture funding and employs hundreds of Australians. So this is happening everywhere around the country. It is incredible to see, particularly as you say, relative to 5 or 10 years ago, we have come such a long way in a really short period of time.
Yeah, I mean, it's nice to be able to take a snapshot where 5 years ago there was nothing and now there's really something.
Yeah.
The really big thing we've got to do now is consolidate some of those gains. I mean, we've got a tipping point where there's these companies that are just about to make it. We've got to lock that in and really secure those wins so that we can make this a stable industry.
Alex McCauley, CEO of Startup Oz, thank you very much for joining us on Startup, on Entrepreneurs. That's what this show is called. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we will be talking to venture capital people for growing Aussie startups.
You're watching Entrepreneurs. Welcome back to Entrepreneurs.
Welcome back to Entrepreneurs. We are exploring the state of play for startups here in Australia. We are joined by serial entrepreneur and founder of the startup Zambesi, Rebecca Campbell, and Jerry Stessel from venture capital group Our Innovation Fund. Jerry, I'm going to start with you. Your portfolio has been incredibly impressive over the last few years, and you put a focus on companies that are born global. What does that mean? Why is it important?
So everyone wants to be the king or queen of Bondi Beach, but unfortunately in software and in technology that isn't good enough. And the reason is if there's a startup that starts in the US or in Europe, and the equivalent startup starts here and their markets are 20, 30 times the size, they're attracting 20 or 30 times the capital, spending 20 or 30 times on R&D. Ultimately, their product's going to be better, and ultimately they will come and outcompete us here. So it's really important to have that global sort of perspective, and I think Australia's a great starting market. But if you do want to capture a large market, particularly in software and technology, you need to focus on global markets as well.
So expand your horizons beyond Bondi Beach is what you're saying?
That's right.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
The other thing that's been impressive with you guys is very strong follow-up funding, right? $21 million to date in follow-up funding. That's got to be encouraging as a fund and looking at the ecosystem at large, right?
Yeah, so one of the things we did is we actually set up an office in New York. We've got a dedicated team there. And we are quite actively involved in helping our portfolio companies raise that next round of capital and get sort of relationships on the ground to help them grow their businesses over there. So yeah, that's something we're quite actively involved with and have dedicated resource on that.
You mentioned New York. You guys offer certain support beyond just the funding. Let's dive into that a little bit deeper. What kind of support is that, and how does that sort of translate on the ground?
So one of the ways we help and roll up our sleeves each day is introduce potential customers to our portfolio companies. And so the team in New York, one of their the things they do quite actively is meet corporates, meet government who are then potential customers for our portfolio companies. And we would always prefer our portfolio companies to take on, $1 of revenue than $1 of funding. And so we're quite actively involved in helping them and introducing them to potential customers over there.
I absolutely love that. Take $1 of revenue over $1 of funding any day.
Yeah.
Now, between 2015 and 2018, VCs in Australia raised more than $4 billion. Do you think this level of funding will continue into the future?
I really hope so, and ultimately it will be pretty simple. If the current crop of VC funds deliver returns to their investors, then it will. I think this time around it is very different to the early 2000s, the tech boom and bust, where people were investing in vaporware and eyeballs to websites. Whereas today the businesses have a lot of substance behind them, have real revenues, have real customers, and so proof will be in the pudding, but ultimately it'll be about delivering returns to investors to keep that momentum going.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thanks, Jerry. Really appreciate that. Rebecca, welcome to Entrepreneurs.
Hi, nice to be here.
Now, you're a serial entrepreneur. On to your third startup, Zambesi. Tell us about Zambesi.
Sure. So Zambesi is a marketplace for leaders at high-growth tech companies to share their skills. So if you're an entrepreneur, you can go and learn growth from the head of growth at Canva, learn leadership from the CEO of Facebook. It's kind of product design, a whole range of things, UX design from people who are kind of at Atlassian, at Canva, at Google, at Facebook, at Airtasker, at all the high growth tech companies. Or if you're a business, you can bring one of these people in to help your team. So the people who are not, like, they haven't left their jobs, they're doing it right now, they've learned some really amazing things, and it's a kind of collaboration marketplace where you can access them and access their skills.
Rebecca, in your view, how important is it for early stage business owners to be learning from people with been there, done that experiences, who are in the trenches every day doing the do?
Yeah, it's super important.
Yeah.
It's very easy to kind of find a mentor when you're a founder.
Yes.
But the mentors that you'll find who have time to give you a lot of advice are often people who maybe did it 10 years ago, and what you actually need is people who are doing it right now.
Yes.
Like if you if you're doing something in SEO or any kind of growth, or the world's changing so fast.
Yeah, it gets outdated
It gets outdated really quickly. What you want to learn if you're thinking about growing your company is what Canva did, like 3 months ago. What's the latest thinking on that particular issue?
Yes. And speaking of Canva, you've also raised a lot of money for your startups. What are some of the key challenges you see in, startup businesses raising money in Australia?
I still think I think that, a few years ago, it was quite hard to raise kind of Series A and beyond. I think that kind of space is now actually pretty well catered. There's a lot of excellent funds.
Yep.
I think that seed is still very hard. So post family and friends, that post the kind of 200, 300 that you might need to get going, that first round, I think is really challenging for people to raise kind of 600, 700 to get a little team in and get going and really give that idea a crack.
Right.
That's a difficult.
Yeah. And other than that sort of canyon, if you like, what's the greatest support required for Australian startups these days in your view?
This is so much, obviously, but I think something that would make a big difference is corporates and government working better with startups.
Yes.
So there's like this big divide of you could be at a corporate and then maybe leave your corporate job and start a company, and there's not really much of a connection between corporates and startups. Corporates are difficult to get to do business with,
yes.
Both because they're reluctant to do business with startups, but also it's just they're not well set up to do business with startups. So if we could work better with, if startups and larger businesses could work better together, then I think that would make a big difference.
Adds to the whole ecosystem.
Yeah.
Now, what's next for Zambezi? Are you looking to make a global play shortly?
Yeah, I mean, we called it Zambezi.com, so obviously it's an ambitious business. But I think it's also okay to build a really good business in Australia and then scale it. So what I'm deliberately focusing on this time is getting the fundamentals of the business right here first. But yeah, we've already got some programs running in Auckland. Next year we'll start to go into some other international cities. But yeah, spending at the moment, we're very focused on getting the fundamentals right.
Fantastic.
Thanks.
Rebecca Campbell and Jerry Stessel, thank you both so much for joining us on Entrepreneurs. It's really encouraging to see the startup ecosystem blossoming the way it has been for the last few years. Thank you both. That's all we have time for tonight. You can tune in anytime on Foxtel Go and on the catch-up section of yourmoney.com.au. Thanks for watching tonight. I'm Jack Delosa. We'll see you next week.